Hey guys, Miss Leaphart here, back to read the next chapter of our Gordon Corman the Hypnotists. We are on chapter 11. Most of the experiment subjects at Sienta were volunteers who were paid $50 a day to participate in brain studies. This brought in an interesting combination of college students and homeless people for the Hypnos to work on. Few, if any, remembered the details of what happened to them at Sienta. Ray Finkelmeyer, the amazing Romolo himself, was charged with implementing a post-hypnotic suggestion to the newcomers. Upon leaving the building, they were instructed to forget everything. Just once, Wilson grumbled, peering out into the lounge window as the volunteers filed inside. I'd like to bend somebody who isn't already used by the time he gets to me. Used? Jackson repeated. He means that the subjects already carry some hypnotic architecture by the time we see them, Kira explained. But it's nothing that would affect our work with them. Says Ray, Wilson countered. What's to stop the staff from adding a little spy suggestion to rat out anybody who might be getting his jollies messed with in their heads? Jax was genuinely mystified. Who would do that? The burly Hypnos glared at him. You don't know anything, do you? Were you born like yesterday? Jack's first subject that day was Mr. Balti. Sienta volunteers never used their real names. Jax wasn't sure why, but the aliases usually came from the Monopoly board. Or Baltic. Mr. Baltic. Vermont Pacific reading. Mrs. Park was short for Park Place, Jax's panhandler. The man in the lumberjacket turned out to be a regular named Mr. St. James. Jax gave the young man across the table a double-barreled shot of his large, color-changing eyes. The result was almost instantaneous. He was looking back at himself, the image faint, but absolutely distinct. He resisted the urge to glance over at Dr. Ameko, who was overseeing the exercise. Okay, Jax instructed the subject. I need you to get out of your chair and jump up and down. Mr. Baltic stood up slowly and began to hop in place in an orderly, unruffled way. This time, Jax did risk a look over at the director. Mako's face was impassive, but surely he had to appreciate how quickly Jax had produced the required action. At the next table, another hypno, Augie Cunningham, stood his subject up and said, You're standing on a bed of hot coals. If you stay at rest for even a second, the soles of your feet will be burned really badly. That was all it took to have Mrs. Tennessee up and dancing with great urgency. Jax regarded Mr. Baltic's half-hearted methodical jumps. Although Mrs. Tennessee was a middle-aged woman, Aggie had generated a much higher level of energy. Mako looked on approvingly. The third and final mindbender took her turn. It was Kira Kendall. A group of children is trapped under a burning house, she told Mrs. St. Charles in an impassioned voice. Flames lick at them from the walls, and the room is filling with smoke. Only you can save them. Your feet operate a pump that sprays water on the fire. Quickly pump. Their lives depend on you. The reaction was nothing short of astounding. The subject's legs hammered like pistons in his mad effort to save the non-existent children Kira had placed in his mind. Mako was smiling and applauding. Well done, Kira. Masterful. What you've shown us is that it's not just a matter of whether someone is hypnotized. The important thing is what we construct in their minds while they're under. A simple instruction is not as powerful as a feeling like fire on your skin. And even if that's not as powerful as something that speaks to your moral character, like saving the lives of children. Jax shuffled out of the room, the loser, the hypnotist who had performed the worst. Why was he the lousiest? What had happened to all the great potential Mako had spoken about? The director must have noticed his crestfallen expression, because afterward he pulled Jax aside. Don't be discouraged, Jackson. All the things that you lack can be learned, but a natural gift can never be created if it isn't there in the first place. Saturdays at Sienta were the marathon days, since the Hypnos came in early and stayed late. The workload was intense and included far more than the hands-on experiments with volunteers. Jax and the others also studied the history of hypnotism and the lives of great the lives of great practicing. That's a really difficult word to say out loud. Boys and girls, even Mrs. Leaphart, even other adults have struggles sometimes. It's been a long day. They studied the lives of the people that practiced the art of hypnotism, like the monk Rasputin and the legendary Dr. Mesmet. Jax was amazed to learn how often hypnotism had played a part in key world events. Sir Edmund Hillary would never have conquered Mount Everest if he hadn't been mesmerized to get over his fear of heights. Brahms was tone deaf and wouldn't have been able to write halfway decent music if his wife haven't been a gifted mind bender. Lewis and Clark were both hypnotists and had bent each other no less than 27 times before they reached the Pacific. It was the only thing that kept them going. The list went on and on. Some of the finest achievements, like the invention of the telephone, the most terrible disasters, like the Hindenburg tragedy, and the most daring crimes, like the Great Train robbery, had all hypnotic connections. Jax was startled to note how often the name Opus came up. No wonder Mako had scouted Jax for Santa. Dad's family was in on it up to their necks. Scarcely did a generation pass without an Opus in the headlines. Wipe that grin off your face, Dupus. Dopus. Wilson calls him Dopus. Wipe that grin off your face, Dopus, Wilson snarled at Jax in the lounge during the break. You may have a famous name, but the legend dies with you. You couldn't hypnotize your way out of a wet paper bag. Kira rolled her eyes. You just got here, Wilson. How many of us were a good mesmerizer in the first week? If Santa had a schoolyard bully, it was definitely Wilson, but all the other hypnos were standoffish. Kira had an innate sense of fairness that refused to let Wilson ride over the others, but she was too serious and dedicated to her craft to be very friendly. She was the best mind bender because she tried 10 times harder than everybody else. She was all work and no play. Not that there was much opportunity for play at Santa. At 17, Augie was the oldest and had been in the institute the longest. Although he had the most experience, it was plain that he had absolutely no sense of humor. He never even smiled, much less laughed. And making a joke was out of the question. Jax, who'd always equated humor with intelligence, wondered if Augie would ever be able to think on his feet well enough to be a top-notch mind-mender. There were 2 Lancaster Singhas, first cousins, named after a common grandfather. They were best friends and competitive to the point of insanity. Each one thought that he could be the Lancaster Sia by out mesmerizing the other. The result was that these 2 talented hypnos expended so much energy bending each other that they had very little left to devote to the actual institute. Wilson called them Singa 1 and Singa 2. The guy was a lughead, but never a loss for a nickname. Grace Kavanaugh was a nationally ranked tennis player and was constantly cutting short her work in the institute to rush off to a match or tournament. Natalie Zingler was confined to a wheelchair, yet her piercing gaze enabled her to entrance a subject faster than any of them, except possibly Jax. Deron Marcus was Wilson's sidekick. He could be perfectly normal and even nice, but then Wilson would walk into the room and Deron's pleasant personality would shut off. During Jax's second week at Santa, there was also a redhead girl, about 16. By Saturday, she was nowhere to be found. Does anyone know what happened to Clarissa? He asked the others. His answer was no answer, a vague, uneasy hum in the lounge. I hope she isn't really sick or anything like that. More humming. It was Singa 2 who finally provided an explanation. She isn't sick. She might be sick, Singa 1 amended, but the reason why she isn't here has nothing to do with her health. Jax must have looked bewildered because Wilson burst out, Will somebody just tell him? She washed out. Dopus. They gave her the boot. Jax was shocked. But why? Did she do something wrong? She wasn't the best of us, Natalie reasoned, and she was getting older. Augie, a year older than Clarissa, shuffled uncomfortably. Or maybe it was just getting a little crowded around here, Wilson suggested cynically. Someone had to go make room for the fair-headed boy. Jax blanched. We don't know anything for sure, Kira jumped in. Dr. Mako always does what's best for the Institute, but nobody can be certain exactly what he's thinking and why. True that, said Wilson with a sneer in Jax's direction. Anyway, it's not like we could look her up and ask her. What do you mean? Jax demanded. Why not? Wilson shrugged. You're the big genius. You figure it out. Last year, Grace said timidly, this guy Rory got bounced. About a month later, I was coming home from a tennis match and I saw him on a subway platform. He definitely saw me. I swear it, but he looked right through me. You can't be sure of that, Kira reminded her. Maybe he's bitter because he was washed out and was ignoring you. Or maybe when you leave this place, you leave without your memory, said Wilson, like cleaning out your desk, only in this case, they clean out your head. But that can't happen, Jax insisted. Can it? It happens to the monopolies every day, Singa-One pointed out. But with them, you're talking about a few hours, Jax argued. Clarissa was here for years. It would take planning, Augie said thoughtfully. A series of post-hypnotic suggestions that would have activated later. That's Ray's specialty, and who knows what Dr. Mako might be capable of. He could have already implanted the groundwork for something like that in all of us, mused Natalie. Count on it, Wilson put in. The doc's not the type to leave things up to chance. But Dr. Mako never bends us, Jax protested. Tolerant chuckles and eye-rolling greeted his statement. Clueless, spat Wilson. Kira was gentler. How many times a day do you use some form of the phrase, when you awaken, you will remember none of this? Jax swallowed hard. At the end of the long Saturday, Jax was on his way to the subway when a tug on his jacket spun him around on the sidewalk. There stood a hulking man, easily twice his weight. Daddy! The man exclaimed in a basso voice that nevertheless sounded like baby talk. I have to go to the bathroom. Shaken, Jax tried to keep on walking. The man scrambled in front of him and blocked his way. I have to go, he insisted. Listen, mister, I'm not your daddy. To his horror, the big fellow clamped his arms of steel around him and squeezed hard. Come on, Daddy. Quit kidding around. I have to go really bad. Jack's legs buckled under him and he fell backwards, drawing the big man on top of him. The guy easily weighed 250 pounds, probably more. Jax? All at once, the beautiful face of Mrs. Samuels was peering down at him. Are you all right? What's going on here? A ringtone sounded very close. It must have been the man's phone. He rolled off Jax and sat up on the pavement, his face a study of confusion. What happened? Did I faint? Jack scrambled to his feet just in time to catch the two figures sprinting down East 65th Street, laughing and celebrating, Wilson and Deron. Wow, kid, I'm sorry. Are you hurt? I'm okay. Jax's eyes were on Mrs. Samuels, who hadn't noticed the fleeing Hypnos. The assistant director had relatively little mesmeric ability herself, but had been around Mako and Santa long enough to recognize hypnotic mischief. Jax had to admit that using the cell phone to break the subject out of his trance had been a brilliant touch. If you could bend a grown man to think he was a 12-year-old kid, that a 12-year-old kid was his daddy, it probably wasn't too hard to get the guy to give you his number. Ms. Samuels regarded Jax suspiciously. Is there anything you want to tell me about this? Something Dr. Mako should know? Jax hesitated. Misuse of hypnotism was a very serious charge at Santa. If it stuck, it would get both Wilson and Deron kicked out of the Institute. They were jerks, but he wasn't sure they deserved it. It was nothing, Jax said finally. That guy must have had a dizzy spell. Okay, so that was chapter 11. We're learning a little bit more about the Santa Institute and what that does for Jax. He's learning how to kind of use his powers a little bit. But we don't really know what the purpose of it is yet. Maybe they're just teaching them how to use their powers. But what do you think? Do you think that when they learn those powers, or if they get kicked out, do they completely forget that they have powers and then they don't use them anymore? I don't know. Chapter 12 up next, guys. Bye.